Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining our webinar, Best Practices for Securing Maximo. My name is Joe Kelly, and along with me to present is Projectec's Information Security Manager, Tyler Caldwell, and our Solution Architect / Lead Developer, Stephen Scholl. We'll discuss our recommendations for best practices when it comes to securing your Maximo system. These best practices can be implemented into your Maximo system starting today. And with that, I'll turn it over to Tyler.
Thanks, Joe. Hi, my name is Tyler Caldwell, and I'm an information security manager with Project here in Cincinnati, Ohio. And today I'm going to be talking about best practices for securing your Maximo application. Um, Over my time here at Project just a brief uh, explanation of some of my background. I'm an information security manager here at Project. I've touched most areas of security. I've taken the company through ISO 27001 certification, SIM implementations, endpoint security, compliance, network security, and as well as some areas of physical security over my time. And I've seen a lot of security challenges with the Maximo application, and I'm here to share what I've learned. Today, we're mostly going to be talking about administrative and technical controls related to securing Maximo. Stephen will later get into the application security component with Maximo. He will be taking a deep dive in that area. Um, I do understand that there are different types of people that are listening to this presentation and viewing this presentation. There's end users, there's engineers, there's management, there's security practitioners. This information should be helpful for all those types. Um, and really, as we move through this presentation, you should be asking yourself on every slide you see is, what is our policy for our company? What is our process? Is it documented? Is it communicated properly to our users? Has our users been trained in that process? It's one of those areas that I think is very helpful as you start to kind of analyze security, especially with a product like Maximo. Um, and this also leads us down another path of security frameworks and compliance. Um, you know, is your company required to comply with NIST or ISO? What is your company's framework that you use for security? Project has chosen ISO 27001, and it's extremely helpful in managing those security requirements. One of the biggest challenges in security that I've really kind of agree in the security groups that I've been in is bringing order to the chaos. And there's so many tools and there's so many articles and so many different types of technologies that are coming out every day. It seems like, what is good for my company? Hey, how much security is enough for my company? Does this apply to my company? So, you know, a security framework allows you to, it gives you, it organizes those thoughts into something tangible. Um, you know, from my own experience, trying to run a security program without a framework, I can best describe as trying to execute a football play without established positions. Everybody knows that you need to score a touchdown. It's just that nobody really knows how to do it. And you know, from my experience, security departments lose track of their primary purpose. And our primary purpose is to support the business. And we must get into that mindset if we're going to apply security in any aspect. So one of the first topics that I'd like to talk about is vulnerability management. And really, if you watch the news in any capacity, there's usually somebody getting breached. The big breach was the Capital One breach, which was highly preventable. And it just seems like every one of these breaches, you're like, oh, geez, that was stupid, or that could have been easily prevented. And this was related to a vulnerability on the web application from AWS. So it comes anyway. A long story short, that it was a vulnerability that should have been recognized and should have been fixed, and it was not, and it was exploited. Now, was it completely Capital One's fault? No. Was it completely AWS's fault? No. But it doesn't matter. Your company's name is out there. Once it's out there, it's out there. So the embarrassment is there no matter what. And really, in terms of vulnerabilities, it's not really a question of how many, or I'm sorry, it's not a question of if you have vulnerabilities. It's really how many vulnerabilities you have and how critical are they. Everyone has them. Where are they? How severe are they? How should I handle those? Um, you know, I- one of the big mistakes that I see in dealing with Maximo applications is that only application vulnerabilities are reviewed, not the supporting infrastructure or modifications made by the support staff. Um, People will read IBM. If you see here in the slide, there is IBM security bulletin information about their actual Maxwell application, but nobody's actually looking at the vulnerabilities of WebSphere, or nobody's looking at the vulnerabilities of the operating system that the Maxwell application is stored on, or uh, the networking equipment. So are vulnerabilities being monitored in your environment? And again, this goes back to my original point of you should be asking yourself in every one of these slides is, what is our policy? Has it been communicated? Is there a process for vulnerability management? And the answer is, if there's not, there should be. um, Another problem that I see with Maximo is that Maximo is extremely customizable. It's one of the big strengths of Maximo is you get Maximo out of the box, but you can do a myriad of things to the application. Integrations, custom class files, custom applications, custom mobile applications that people will write, custom portals that will attach on those applications. Is security evaluated on those add-on applications? Is the integration security properly, analyzed? What is the process? There are vulnerability information released from IBM, which is on the slide. There are a lot of sites online that have just overall vulnerabilities. There's OWASP. There is a lot of information out there. What is your process of retrieving that information? And not just, this goes back to my original point too of bringing order to the chaos. There's almost too much information out there where it's almost an overload when you start to analyze. There's some new botnet out there, or there's some new malware campaign. Well, does this apply to me? Is this on the systems that we use? So there's a lot of analysis that goes into vulnerability management. There's another source that I often use. It's called US CERT. They have great information about vulnerabilities. They do a weekly vulnerability report, which my security team uses personally for just weekly reviews of our infrastructure. IBM X Force Exchange is another one which is the image on the slide. It's a really cool security site. And also, we'll get into some log management as well, which will tie into vulnerabilities, or just visibility into your infrastructure. Patch management. This is another one. And again, it's going to be a broken record on this presentation in terms of what is your policy. It hasn't been. What is your process? What is your policy? Um, the key is too is patching is extremely complicated with Maximo at times, because, as I stated previously, there are a lot of different moving parts with Maximo. Sometimes, sometimes there's Maximo Anywhere, or there's Data Splice, or there's Easy Max Mobile, as well as the application, as well as WebSphere, as well as some custom portal that your company has designed. Are those getting patched? Are the supporting components getting patched? And also with patch management, one of the big challenges that I've seen is fear of change. A lot of times there is an upgrade or a patch to an application, but it modifies a certain field in a work order, for example, or it does something to that effect, that will spook users. And there has to be a balance in your organization. There has to be communication on these patching requirements, why we're patching, and who all needs to be notified of those patch requirements. um, and also patching properly, right? We should never patch production applications first. It should always be some kind of test environment, QA, whatever your organization uses, prior to getting to production. If you have that luxury, I know some organizations don't have that luxury, but if you have a non-production environment to patch and test and do whatever, and always do it in non-production first. And as well as patching, proper regression testing upon patch completion. I've seen this a ton of times too, where we upgrade some application. We patch WebSphere to some new major version, and we do minimal testing when we're done. Just basic functionality. I can get into the app. I can get into various modules, but we don't really deep dive into what users are doing. So then we release the newly patched application to end users, and those end users are doing some things with contracts you had no idea that they did, and all of a sudden it's broken. I'm sure this has happened to a lot of people listening to this presentation, and the key is to have a process for testing, for regression testing and proper sign off. We have to get past of just checking to see if you can log in and just doing basic 3 4 5 steps. You really have to have a plan, some type of scripted process. There's actually a bunch of tools out there that you can have that are automated tools that actually do testing just like that, where you can actually create a script and it'll execute the script and create a work order and that kind of stuff, just to take a deeper dive into the regression testing process. So I highly recommend those. Change management necessarily is, I mean, it's really designed more for for maintaining the integrity of the application, as well as communication with customers and employees and support staff. I'm sure a lot of people on this listening to this presentation have had something change in their Maximo application that nobody knew was coming, or just a very small subset of support staff knew was going to occur, but it wasn't properly communicated, or if it was communicated, it wasn't communicated properly. And this is, again, what is your policy? What is your procedure? There was a Salesforce outage a few months ago that was directly related to change management. There was a database administrator that went to a production database. One, he didn't test properly prior to going to production. Two, he didn't, the change was not communicated and tested properly um, prior to the production implementation. So what had happened was he essentially gave God rights to the planet, and that was not good. So it was a big black eye on Salesforce. It was another problem that could have been prevented. Excuse me. Most of these problems that you see with breaches and with integrity type of issues, I'd say the majority of them could be prevented, and this was one of them. Um, you know, Change management is also one of the most heavily evolving process that I'll discuss today. There's so many moving parts with the change process. There's flow charts, documentation, approval, communication are paramount to the success of this program. In our company, here at Project Tech, there are changes are defined by criticality level and risk level, and certain risk levels require certain communications with higher ups. A critical change for us requires X amount of days notice to customers and approval from a higher committee compared to a lower or medium change. Are you doing that evaluation in your company? Is there proper communication with this? That and again, communication is really I'd say the foundation of change management. If you don't have proper communication, the whole thing falls apart. This department doesn't know about it, that department does, or this department does know about it and they're not happy about the change, or they feel there's a higher risk. The change was evaluated, but the communication back to the person who implemented the change was not done correctly. So there's so many things that can go wrong in the change process, which is why it's heavily audited for environments like validated environments and FedRAMP type of environments. It's heavily relied upon. So if your company is going to go down the compliance route in any time in the future, I would highly recommend getting a proper change management process. Um, Project Tech actually uses Maximo for change management. We actually use the change module in Maximo. It's the same with a lot of things we do related to security. We use work orders, we use incidents, we use assets. So we use our product for a lot of this, and Maximo has that all built in for the majority of this stuff. When I get audited during our ISO audits, the auditors love that we use Maximo. They love for me to be able to pull up the asset module and just give them a report in 2 seconds of all of our assets. I can run reports on incidents, various changes. We implement workflows into our change management. So, meaning that you have to execute the workflow, and push it through the workflow, which actually tracks your identity for approval, review, all of that. So we can track on who created the change, who approved it, who reviewed it, what date and time, all of that, which is very very important in audits. Um, so again, change management is extremely important. And backups, this is huge. You know I like to tell my users what would happen if somebody took your device, whatever it is, tablet, laptop, cell phone, whatever, and just threw it in the lake. What would happen to you right now? And I know it seems a little dramatic, but I think it helps users understand, what is important on this device. It's getting to the point where everything is going to the cloud. I mean, there's OneDrive and Google Drive, and there are a million different technologies out there for backups. So and they're getting cheaper and cheaper. But with online backups or cloud backups, there's obviously risk, pros and cons, on-site, off-site. That's not necessarily what the scope of this presentation is, but the key is to make sure that you have backups, and backups tie directly into disaster recovery. That's really what it's all about. Is something some bad thing happened typically, and I need to restore this data in some way. And I think people will get tripped up a lot of times when it comes to backups, where they will just consider the Maximo data backup in terms, the actual database backup, whatever, SQL, Oracle, D2, whatever. They will concern themselves with that, but they'll forget about all of the supporting infrastructure. So, if you did lose a data center, or if you lose your on-site, data in some way, yes, you have the data, but you have to rebuild the application servers, or the supporting infrastructure, which then ups your RTO up to to Lord knows what. So the key is what are you backing up? What is your RPO? Meaning your recovery point objective, meaning that what is the data loss that is acceptable to your company. Some companies can lose up to 15 minutes, and that's way too much. you know if you ask that question to certain people in in your company, a lot of times they'll be like, well, no data loss is acceptable, and I understand that. But you have to be realistic in the world of backup, in terms of, yeah, we can have real-time backups and mirroring and all that kind of stuff, hot sites and all that, but there's a cost. So what makes sense for your organization? What are you allowed to lose, that the security controls are reasonable to manage and cost? Right? Is it an hour? Is it 2 hours? That's on something for you, for you and your organization to determine. But it's questions that you should be asking. If you're not in charge of disaster recovery, if you're not in charge of backups, you should be talking to who is in charge of that. If you're in charge of a Maximo application, you should be asking that question. What is our backup procedure? If I lose the application today, if our server room gets flooded, if there's a fire, what do we do? Where are the backups stored? Are we checking those backups? And I'll say this too, it's just as important to actually test your backup process, and your data loss, as it is to just configure it in the first place. I've seen this many a times where you ask your backups. Oh yeah, there's backups. Oh, so can you give me a backup from last Thursday? A customer wants to look at something, and the person goes to look for the backup. Oh, backups haven't been running for 2.5 months. I just haven't gotten alerted for it. I don't have reporting set up. So testing your backups, setting up alerts, monitoring your backup process is extremely important. It happens all the time. Um, and again, backing up, all components of your Maximo application, not just, backing up the server or backing up whatever. It's the custom, or excuse me, it's the custom Maximo installation files, or custom class files, logos, all that kind of stuff that's not out of the box that a lot of companies use. Most companies that I've seen, their application is customized in some way. It's pretty rare that a customer just takes it out of the box and goes. There's usually some kind of customization. So is that customization backed up? Is there an integration? Is that integration backed up? What's the plan for disaster recovery if it goes down in terms of integrations? Is the integration just going to be down until you fail back? Or what is the plan? Your you know your organization may be fine with running your application at a degraded state, but has that been communicated? Has that been communicated to customers? Is it tested? So all those questions you need to ask yourself, and ask people in your organization. So one of the slides here, single sign-on and role-based access control is another key. I, uh, so in in today's world of IT, am sure that you're dealing with just user accounts everywhere, and it's one of the big problems we have. Just managing passwords, managing access. When we get a new employee here at Project Tech, it's a challenge sometimes, if we don't have some type of identity access, system here to manage all of that. Single sign-on, really, the entire point of single sign-on, or one of the major pros of single sign-on is to reduce administrative overhead. It improves the user experience, and it boosts productivity. um, you know Users having to manage 15 different user accounts is always a pain, and there's a lot of security risks with that. If you're having a lot of complex passwords, all of that, it just makes it harder on the user, and the user is eventually just going to cut corners. They're going to start storing passwords on a sticky note onto their keyboard. They're going to store it on a text file on their laptop, whatever it is. So the system has to be usable is the key, or users will not use it. If there's a way around it, they will find a way around it, and they won't. So, single sign on, and it also has its cons, obviously. I mean, it's the keys to the kingdom, right? If you get the keys to the kingdom, then it opens up to all the other applications as well. So it's definitely not all good. Um, but native auth poses, a multitude of problems. That it's just there's lack of visibility, there's permission creep, as well as just failure to follow the security policy. So, I've seen countless organizations take somewhat of a lazier approach in terms of just implementing user security. Everybody gets admin permissions, right? Take the time up front, which this ties into role-based access control, but take the time up front, understand what type of security that your user needs, and implement that user security based on their need. Role-based access control is what the name says. It's based on your role. And your role in the company gives you various types of access control. And again, it takes a lot of work up front, but it pays off in the end. And the this again, this ties back to the original question: is what is our policy? What is our account provisioning policy in our company? Do we just sign up and just give everybody user and just go? Do we give everybody max admin privileges and go? I mean, okay, if that's what if your organization is okay with that, then that's fine. But again, what is your process? How are you administering accounts? Single sign-on is excellent because it consolidates a lot of those accounts and makes it easier for administrators to manage and monitor the overall security of the organization. Role-based access control is what it is. It is access control based on your role. A person who works in accounting should not have access to all of our back-end infrastructure, or VMs. And the person who the infrastructure administrator should not have access to the company financials, because it's just not in their job role. It's really as simple as that. And again, it takes a lot of work up front, but it will pay off in the end. And I touched a little bit on disaster recovery during the backup component of this, but again, this is just extremely important. Um, some of you may have a service through another company. Some of you may be direct providers of Maximo. But again, what is the plan? Has your SaaS provider provided you with at least a high level disaster recovery plan if you do lose the application? What is your RPO, or your recovery point objective? How much data loss are you going to be is acceptable to your organization? What is the RTO, or the recovery time objective? How long is it going to take to get my application back up? Because that's really what customers typically care about. Is they don't really care about what's going on behind the scenes. They just want to know how much data loss occurred and when they're going to have their application back online. And those questions should be answered, by your provider. They may not be able to give detailed information to you on the actual disaster recovery plan or procedure, but they should be able to give you at least a high level policy. RTO and RPO should be public knowledge, or at least knowledge to their customers. Um, Testing is key on DR. DR is only good if management knows what to do, if people know what to do. And you have to plan for, as I say, the 3 o'clock in the morning scenario. Because it just seems like every disaster that I've been a part of, every time something goes down, it's never at 2 o'clock in the afternoon on a Tuesday. It's always at 3 o'clock in the morning on a Sunday morning, or something, some very bad time where everybody's waking up and just not knowing what's going on. um, the key to a good disaster recovery plan is have that scenario worked out to where people will just essentially pick up their guide, their checklist for their team or for them, whatever they need to do, and go. There's not a lot of analysis going on at 3 o'clock in the morning. And how often is that tested? So, and again, this next statement may sound obvious, but your production or non-production, excuse me, your disaster recovery site should always be in a geographically separate location from your production site. That may sound obvious, but to some people it's not. But the reason is somewhat obvious, is that obviously there's a hurricane or an earthquake or whatever that is environmental. You want that to be in a different you want your disaster recovery site to be in a different location to help avoid having the same issues on both sides. And the final topic we'll discuss today is user training. This is extremely important in securing your application. Maximo is a very powerful tool. It's not like a lot of applications that are very locked down. Maximo can be wide open, meaning that it will allow your users to do a lot of things, especially around the reporting area, just setting up any type of integrations or automations, any of that kind of activity has a high potential to crash the application, and we've seen it time and time again. A user logs into the system, they run a report, of what they think is the work orders for the past week, and they run a report for every work order that they've ever created, and they run it every minute. So, and it eventually just crashes the system. It's too much. Or it causes some kind of major disruption. So, a lot of these areas can be easily mitigated with training, especially around those areas that have potential. There a lot of times users will be in or adding data to an application and not quite sure of what they're doing with various data load activity, and they completely corrupt their data, and they have to roll back. It's a big mess. Again, database configs, scheduled reports, all of that should be tested prior to doing anything in production. Any type of report writing that is that would be considered verbose. Any testing and implementation components that could crash an application should always be tested in a non-production environment first. To avoid these issues. I've seen that time and time again, where they roll changes straight to production. There's problems. The user wasn't aware that it would cause this issue because they did not test properly in non-production. So if you have that capability, please do so. So that being said, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Stephen Shull, and he's going to take a deeper dive into web application security.
Thank you, Tyler. I am Stephen Shull, Project X Solution Architect / Development Lead, and I've been a 4-time IBM champion the past 4 years. I've been using Maximo for about 9 years at this point, working on most versions from version 4.1 all the way up to 7.6.1. One of the most important things in identifying when you're setting up a Maximo system is what Maximo authentication mechanism is best for your environment. We strongly encourage customers to evaluate SAML or something like OpenID Connect, because we find this gives us the best security controls with the least risk from a security perspective. So most identity providers have things like two-factor authentication, so ensuring that someone has a mobile phone or some other authentication mechanism like Touch ID or something along those lines. Similarly, it can have additional benefits like risky login detection. So if you're trying to authenticate from an untrusted IP address, or whether you're trying to use a device that you haven't logged in before, those kinds of things add another layer of protection to your Maximo environment. Also importantly, it's an easier experience for the end users. If you're trying to use just native Maximo authentication or LDAP, someone's trying to have to type in their username and password throughout the day. Most identity providers just have a one-click, you launch in, and then you're into your Maximo environment. One of the downsides, unfortunately, is there are some issues with third-party applications. So especially if you have mobile products, make sure that's something that you evaluate before you decide to make that transition. Also, something to be aware of is if you use eSig inside of Maximo, which is important, especially for validated environments, does not work when you try to use SAML or OpenID Connect. And of course, you need to be on a relatively current version of Maximo. Anything 7.603 or higher, you'll be able to use SAML. If that doesn't work for one of those reasons, LDAP would be our next recommendation. This still allows the IT department to have that single identity for that user. They should know that username and password because that's what they use to log into their device. It's widely supported by third parties. There's no really known issues or limitations that we're aware of with any of the popular mobile products, integrations, etc. Everything just kind of works. So it gives you a little bit better layer than just native authentication while addressing any potential issues that would prevent you from using SAML. Something else we encourage customers to evaluate is the concept of distinct integration accounts. A lot of people historically have used MXINT-admin or MaxAdmin for those integrations, which is easy and convenient, but unfortunately it ignores a lot of security best practices. If you have an integration that is entirely designed for pulling information, those credentials are able to do much, much more than what is required for that integration. So you should evaluate what access is required for that integration and set up a user that only has that access. One of the most exciting things that IBM added to the security front is in Maximo 7605, they created this concept called object structure security. So previous to 7605, everything for an object structure had to be defined with either no security, which means that as long as you had authentication, you were able to use that object structure, or it could be associated to an app, such as asset. The problem with that approach is if you are an end user, you're going to have access to those apps, such as asset. That doesn't necessarily mean that you should be able to use the integration. So in 7605, they came up with a new mechanism that allowed you to define object structure level security. This would allow you to say that this group should have access to these object structures. And if you don't have access to those object structures, you can't use them, even if you can access those core underlying applications. There's also a new system property that they added, this enable OS auth, which is a little bit confusing because you can use object structure security without it. What this does is it actually enforces that you use object structure authentication for everything. So if you haven't gone through and added security back to one of those applications or one of those object structures, then this will actually enforce that you cannot use that object structure without having the security defined for that object structure. Just be aware there were a couple of issues when they first implemented this, particularly around the old REST API and stuff like in Migration Manager. So if you try to enable this, just be aware there may be some things that are broken if you haven't upgraded to a more recent version. All right, now we're going to take a look at this inside of the Maximo system. Well, all right, and as you'll notice, there's this new authorization name field, and you'll see that it's completely blank. What this means is there is zero security configured for this object structure. If you have a username and password, you can use this object structure whether or not you're entitled to be able to manage work orders or not. So to configure this, there's this new action called configure object structure security. And you can do one of two things. You can, if you want to leave it associated to the application, you can filter and say, I want to associate this to work order tracking. But what we encourage people to do is just because you have access to the application doesn't mean that you know how to interact with Maximo from an integration perspective. So we encourage most people to create each one as its own security model. And you can do that by checking this use object structure for authorization name. And what that'll do is it'll actually generate a security model for this particular object structure. And it'll come with a couple of options out of box, such as being able to delete, insert, read, or save. And potentially, if you don't like the naming of the SIG options, you can relabel them, such as delete work order. Then from there, you'd go to the security groups application. So we're going to go to security groups. And there's this new tab called object structures that you'll be able to actually associate object structure security for this group. So I'm going to say MaxAdmin is a pretty trustworthy group. Let's allow them to have access to this object structure. If this was purely designed for consuming, if I didn't need to update records, a better practice would be to just give it access to save, or sorry, just access to read. And then that way, only thing that we'll be able to do is actually read Maximo work order data. We won't be able to send any updates. If we tried to update one of the records using the API, Maximo will throw an error saying we don't have access to do it. And that's a quick intro into object structure security. Something that's been an issue for a while, but didn't really come to attention until somewhat recently, was that the SOAP web services by default were allowed unauthenticated connections. So what that meant is if you could hit that Maximo system, you didn't even have to authenticate in order to be able to use those APIs. It would actually give you the permissions of MXINT admin, which from a security perspective is a huge security risk, especially if you expose your Maximo environment publicly. So for a long time now, we've been forcing all of these to require authentication. And starting in 7603, they made it easier to do because now through a system property, you can actually control whether or not you allow default logins. The system property may or may not exist. If not, you'll have to create it. But this will take precedence over the settings that used to have to be done in the XML file, which required an outage. I've sent a link here for A3J. They have a wonderful blog post and walking you through this if you need more information. Securing Maximo attachments is really important because the attachments often have confidential financial information, such as if you have copies of a PO that you sent to a vendor, or if you have certain work order information. That information is critical to the Maximo system, and you want to make sure that that data is properly secured. There's a system property that Maximo has had for a long time, way back even in the 7.1 days, maybe even before then, to enable secured attachments. By default, the guides used to walk you through setting up a virtual directory inside of IIS or your IBM HTTP server. But the problem with that is anyone that had access to that virtual directory URL would be able to access the attachment, whether they were authenticated into Maximo or not. So in order to prevent that, you can enable this secured attachment setting, which will render one-time URL links inside of the Maximo system. So everything that gets accessed as that user from the Maximo system, and someone can't just send a link to somebody else inside the organization and have them be able to view that attachment. So this gives us a much better security layer with very little overhead from the Maximo system. The only other caveat that I wanted to call out, just so that you're aware, is it does require that you disable URL validation on the attachments if you're trying to use direct print. So I called out that system property below as well. All right, I'm going to give you a quick intro from the Maximo perspective of using secured attachments. So as you can see in this environment, I've already turned on secured attachments. And so now I'm going to show you what this looks like from an end user perspective. So if I go into one of these work orders, I'm just going to associate a new attachment. So I'm going to go to my pictures. I'm a big fan of Dilbert, so we're going to associate a Dilbert comic. And when I go to one of these attachments, if I go and try to hover over this, what you'll notice is the URL that Maximo is trying to use is this /Maximo/servlet/secure provider, and then you just see some crazy text. If we were not using secured attachments, this would actually be a really simple URL like mw.maximo.com/doclinks/attachments/ and then whatever the attachment name is. That obviously makes it super easy to guess, but with this generated URL, it'll only work for this session and it'll only work once. Once I click this link, I will download the attachment. And if I go back to it, I now actually have a completely different link that again is just a one-time generated. So no one can provide that link to somebody else and worry that that other person will be able to access that attachment. Something that we have to strongly encourage customers to do is try to stay relatively current. You don't necessarily need to be latest and greatest, but as part of these releases, IBM doesn't just give new features. They also take a step back and try to implement better security practices. And one of the biggest things in the recent past was related to the removal of Java applets in Adobe Flash. For those that aren't super technical, the Java applets were a very popular way to develop applications in the past, but they have a lot of security risk associated with them. At this point, the only browser that still allows Java applets and will only be allowing it for a short period of time is Microsoft Internet Explorer. And on top of that, the more recent versions of Java have actually removed the applet functionality. So in order to get away from that, IBM came up with a new process related to direct print and for workflow that allow you to remove the need for that Java applet. So you can use any browser. You have zero dependencies on other insecure technologies like ActiveX, Adobe Reader, no dependent software on the client computer such as Microsoft Office. It just really makes the direct print process streamlined for the end user. It makes it substantially more reliable in addition to being more secure. Adobe Flash really kind of only impacted those people with linear. If you didn't have linear, there's no real other Adobe Flash components. But again, that was removed in linear 7.6. Maximo has some really good controls around transactional data, such as work orders, assets, etc. But one of the things that we strongly recommend for customers is to look at some of the configuration related tables and turn on e-audit. E-audit, for those that are unaware, is a way to record changes to any table inside of Maximo where you can say these particular attributes from that table we care to audit anytime it changes. So the history in automation scripts or dbconfig related changes or presentation related changes is pretty much non-existent. So we determined in order to be able to properly identify who changed something, when they changed something, and exactly what they changed, we needed to turn on e-audit on a lot of these core system tables so that we can have that proper historical tracking that we need to better support our customers. If a new issue is identified, we're able to actually go and say, yep, it looks like this person changed this application on this date. This is what they changed it from, and this is what they changed it to. And then from there, we can go and actually try to resolve the issue. If you don't have e-audit turned on these tables, some of those situations become very hard to identify. And no one wants to sit and try to do point-in-time restores to figure out what went wrong. The other big thing to be aware of, though, is while e-audit is a great feature, you have to be careful to only restrict it to things that matter. A lot of people get really tied in. They want to know anything that changed. But maybe that description field doesn't really mean that much in the grand scheme of things, so maybe it's not worth auditing. Similarly, most people turn on e-audit on weird fields like change by or change date. That information's kind of irrelevant because e-audit by default already has that. So if someone changed something, but it wasn't one of the other fields that you cared about, turning on e-audit on change by will just give you a lot of noise and without a lot of value. So you want to make sure you restrict it just to that data set that you care about. I'm going to do a quick intro into e-audit on some of the system tables. I'm not going to go through all the tables, just want to kind of show you how you would configure it on something like max prop value, which if you're unaware what that table is, that is where we track system properties inside of Maximo. So the first thing you have to do is you have to turn on e-audit on that table. So it's a simple checkbox, it'll automatically generate the audit table. And now you get to go through and set which attributes you want to audit. The first and biggest one that anyone should audit is this concept of prop value. So prop value is actually going to be the system property value that is going to be utilized. So for example, if we were enabling secured attachments, this would be the true statement in secured attachments. Now, something you'll notice is I'm not going to turn on e-audit on prop name, server host, or server name because those are part of the primary key column sequence. So if you look at this primary column, you'll see these are 1, 2, and 3. Those are going to automatically be recorded by the Maximo framework no matter what. So prop name is not something I really have to worry about changing, neither is server host or server name, because they become read-only after creation. And because it's already audited, I don't actually need to go through and try to turn on e-audit for these values because they'll already be audited. On this particular table, nothing else is really relevant to try to turn e-audit on because we don't care about change by or change date. We'll get that automatically, and the other things are part of the primary key. So I can save this. And then once I'm done, all I have to do is go back to the list view and I'll be able to apply configuration changes. Now, as long as I don't have any other changes going on inside of the Maximo system, this is a non-structural change, so you can add new e-audit tables and or attributes at any time without necessarily requiring a downtime window.
Thanks, Stephen. This is great stuff. Please be sure to complete the survey at the end of the webinar, and thanks again for attending. Have a good day.